And are we doing a good blueprint check on our faith? See, if we know the blueprint, if we know the scriptures, if we know the word, if we have immersed ourselves in that, we're going to be able to see falsehood when it comes our way. And priority number four was the Besorah of the gospel for all people, making sure that we're not coming in on a mentality of factionalism. The title of my message today is Under the Wrong Persuasion. Under the Wrong Persuasion. Now maybe that is a controversial statement. I don't know, because you've heard that in different contexts. But these Galatians were being persuaded by either people that grossly misunderstood the Besorah, the good news, the gospel, or they were not believers at all, and they had converted to Judaism, and they wanted these Gentiles to convert to Judaism because there is a sense of status, class, prestige in being Jewish, and they wanted to raise up a following for themselves. Under the wrong persuasion. I'm going to continue. And we're going to address another term, and then I'll have to wrap up. But in verse 21, and Paul gives this interesting midrash. In verse 21, he says, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, under the Torah, do you listen to the Torah?" Now, I want to just address the issues. I've heard people make the issue that when Paul uses this phrase, under the Torah, we talked about it last week, that it means under the oral Torah. When Paul uses this in a negative sense, he says what he's really saying is that he's rebuking for them to be under the oral Torah because they are supposed to be under the Torah. And people that oftentimes try to make this position, they feel that if Paul is in fact talking about the Torah itself when he uses this term under the Torah, that somehow Paul is speaking against the Torah and he's inconsistent with it, and it's an inconsistency in Scripture. But let's see what that sounds like whenever Paul uses this phrase. In verse 4. Look at verse 4 in chapter 4. "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the oral Torah, so that he might redeem those who were under the oral Torah, that we might receive adoption as sons." Does that seem to really make sense? And it got the answer. And is there any other point? The question is, if it is the oral Torah, when is Paul talking about the oral Torah, and when is he actually talking about the Torah? That doesn't seem to really ever come up. It doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't really fit if Paul's talking about, and he's rebuking the oral Torah. For one thing, the oral Torah was not even firmly established at this point. That's not until the 4th and the 5th century underneath the Talmud when we see in the Mishnah, when we see oral Torah being codified. Also, too, as well, another weakness of that position is that Yeshua himself actually advocated for some of the oral Torah. Not all of it, and much of it he was against, but there are some elements of it that he actually promotes and keeps. So we would have to ask the question, well, which part of it is Paul talking about, if Paul is saying that? It doesn't really add up if we plug that in. By the way, we have proof text here that this is not the oral Torah that he's talking about. Why? Because what happens in verse 22? "For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons." Now what's he quoting? Genesis. He's quoting from Scripture. He's quoting from the Torah. And he says, this phrase under the Torah. So again, I make the point that when Paul uses the term under the Torah, in some instances he's just talking about Jewish status and being Jewish. There are other instances where under the Torah means under the condemnation of the Torah and under its judgment. That's how he uses it back in Romans chapter 6. And so, again, it's not the issue that Paul's against the Torah or has an issue with the Torah, but how is it being used? And that's the real question here. But he gives this interesting midrash. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh. Now, who is that? That's Ishmael. And the son by the free woman was born through the promise. That was Sarah, right? This is allegorically speaking. This is one of the only times where I think, and by the way, it's Genesis, the account here is its own narrative. It's its own story. It's not an allegory, but Paul's using it allegorically here to make a point.